Good morning. Are we transmitting? We are going to do, if nothing happens, Acts 25 and 26 today. My goal is to finish Acts next week. I am teaching 2 high school classes, and I'm teaching church history at the school this quarter. And so my cup runs over a good bit. And we're going to try to finish this today. The way I teach, I read, think, Waller all week long. And I've got too many things to think and Waller, so we're going to try to wind it up. Acts has been a good study, and one of the things that comes to my mind this summer, we have really had a fast summer, and we've had a whole lot of good preaching and teaching and classes, and the summer series has gone well. Our gospel meeting was excellent. Eric Owens gave us a fresh look at grace. A couple of weeks ago, Drew preached a lesson on marriage, divorce, and remarriage. All these things that have gone on and happened, plus my study, have shown to me the need to continually preach the whole counsel of God. Because we can get things wrapped up in our minds and think that a thing is true, but if we don't look back and check what we think against the Bible, we can easily get off track, because it's pretty easy to think you're right about something and be wrong. And Howard said something in his prayer that kicked me back to Eric Owens' lessons. When we pray to God for forgiveness, we know He'll forgive us. A lot of times we don't tend to think that way, but He does. And those are things that need continual reminding. There was 2 or 3 points in Drew's lesson that made me think back. As I studied this church history course, a couple of things, well, actually only one thing really, but this is a glaring one because I had got it stuck in my head the canon was completed in 150. It's 250. The simple thing, but it just shows you how easily your mind can glom onto something and it be wrong, but you think it's right. And it's literally how the church got off track as it moved away from the apostles and the inspired men, because people began to talk about the truth without referencing it, and philosophizing about the truth without referencing it. And we can be guilty of that same thing if we don't keep our minds focused on the truth, and we continually preach every subject. Chris or whoever preaches doesn't get up here and preach with somebody in mind. It's just things we need to hear over and over and over and need to be challenged about. And I don't know how many times I've read The Eternal Kingdom. I should be able to quote it, but I can't. And reading it this time, I'm pulling things out that I didn't have before. And so the study in Acts has been valuable to me. I hope it has been to you. Last week, we pretty much finished chapter 24. And a couple of comments as we get rolling on chapter 25. And it actually is included in the first question on chapter 25. How long did Paul wait in prison to finally be heard by Festus? Felix put him in prison. Felix was a corrupt politician, and he was shaken by Paul's message of the truth. It made him fear for his own future, but not enough to do anything about it because he's a politician. And so he sticks Paul in prison and winds up staying there for 2 years while Felix is hoping that they'll come bail him out and he'll get money from it. And what did we know about Felix from our study of chapter 24? He was a crook. He was capable of doing anything to further his own ends. And so he winds up being replaced by Nero with Festus. And it's believed that possibly Nero's mistress, who was a Jew, her name was Poppy, had influenced Nero to get Felix out of there because he was hard on her people. And an interesting thing about Nero, because we all view him as crazy, he was toward the end, But Nero reigned for 16 years, and the first 11 years of his reign, he was not malevolent toward the Jews. Paul appeals to Caesar. You think Paul would have appealed to the Nero we saw on the tail end of his reign? He might have risked going back to Jerusalem, but that's not the way God wanted things to work. But Nero initially was fair-minded. And, his girlfriend, mistress, was a Jew and obviously had influence on him. He later married her. But he removes Felix because Felix was making it hard on the Jews. What's unique about Christianity that resulted in Rome coming down on it hard? That's two big things. Initially, Rome was not hard on Christianity. Why? What was their position toward existing religions in the empire? Do what? Yeah, what did you say, Jack?
Well, they were kind of open-minded. They kind of encouraged a lot of different gods. So when Christianity comes along, it's just another god. So they were pretty tolerant of other religions. As long as you would admit that Caesar also was a god.
Yeah, you had to be an endorsed religion. For the Romans. They were a far-flung empire, and their position was one of tolerance. If there were a region that they had taken, they allowed them to continue in their religion as long as it didn't get in the way of the government. If it became a threat to government, then it was a problem. And Christianity they viewed initially as just Judaism. They figured it one and the same. And when they finally came to the conclusion that Christianity was not Judaism, and that was with the help of some malicious information from the Jews, then it became a problem because the Christians worshipped a different king. They didn't realize that Christians could be the best friend they had to the empire because they were obedient to the Roman law. They obeyed the law. They operated within the law, and their attitude about the law was the best thing that the Romans could have had, where the Jews were continually willing to stand against it, to rebel against it. We talked about the sects and all that last week. But, Rome eventually figures it out 300 years down the road or 200 years down the road. But in the period of time that we're looking at here, Nero's the emperor, and everybody knows how Nero turned. But as we look at this chapter, we'll see some things come to light here. The scriptures that involve what we just talked about, Acts 24:26 through 25:2, he hoped also that money should have been given him of Paul that he might loose him. Wherefore he sent for him the oftener and communed with him. But after 2 years, Porcius Festus came into Felix's room, and Felix, willing to show the Jews a pleasure, left Paul bound. Now when Festus was coming to the province, after 3 days, he ascended from Caesarea to Jerusalem. Then the high priest and the chief of the Jews informed him against Paul and besought him. When it says that Festus came into Felix's room, Festus replaced Felix. Felix was called back to Rome, and nothing is said or known in history about what happened to Felix after the fact. But he was replaced because of his inability to be an administrator, for his crookedness in essence, based on what Josephus had to say about him. The only thing we know about Festus comes from Acts and Josephus. And he took over, it's estimated, in the year AD 60. By this time, Nero had been in power 4 years. Josephus seemed to hold Festus in a favorable light. And so, what do you say about Festus? There's not a ton you can add to it from history. But when you look at Festus in this chapter, it would seem, in thinking about what Festus did, that he is a somewhat honorable man, an honest man. And you see that in the recounting of what had taken place since he'd gotten there to Agrippa. He didn't embellish it. He told it like it happened. And as we've looked at these accounts of Luke on different people, a lot of times you see embellishment trying to make yourself look better. And Festus didn't. The fact that Josephus held him in a favorable light doesn't mean a ton, because Josephus was jilted toward the Romans anyway. But anyway, Josephus is our only source of information outside of Luke. Number 2, what did the chief priests and Jews ask of Festus? Yeah, you've not had time to look over this and think about it, I realize, but it's amazing that these Jewish leaders, after 2 years, still seethed with hate. In Acts 25, 2 through 8, then the high priest and the chief of the Jews informed him against Paul and besought him, and desired favor against him, that he would send for him to Jerusalem, laying wait in the way to kill him. But Festus answered that Paul should be kept at Caesarea, and that he himself would depart shortly thither. Let them therefore, said he, which among you are able, go down with me and accuse this man, if there be any wickedness in him. And when he had tarried among them more than 10 days, he went down into Caesarea, and the next day, sitting on the judgment seat, commanded Paul to be brought. And when he was come, the Jews which came down from Jerusalem stood round about and laid many and grievous complaints against Paul, which they could not prove. While he answered for himself, neither against the law of the Jews, neither against the temple, nor yet against Caesar have I offended anything at all. After all this time, people cool off usually over a period of time. 2 years is a pretty long time, and they're still enraged. And so their plan is still to get Paul out of there and kill him. Paul's aware of that. Festus is a politician. We'll answer 3 and 4 together. What did Festus ask of Paul after the Jews made their empty accusations against him in Caesarea, and how did Paul respond?
Go back to Jerusalem. Because when you try him in Jerusalem.
Why?
Because the Jews wanted him to go to Jerusalem so they could kill him on the way. So he just wanted to keep the Jews a favor.
Yeah. It says in the Scriptures that he was willing to do the Jews a favor. Festus is a politician. Politicians do favors for a reason. It's not necessarily out of the goodness of their heart they do anything. They do it to gain favor and support. And so Festus had no ill will toward Paul. We'll see that he would have freed Paul. But he wanted to try to gain favor with the Jews. He was in Caesarea for 3 days before he went up to Jerusalem to visit. And so he didn't mess around once he was in office. And when they come down and make their false accusations, he sees through it. But he wants to do them a favor, so he's willing to hear him in Jerusalem. So he asked Paul if he'd be willing to go back to Jerusalem and face his accusers. Paul already knows if that happens, he'll be ambushed and killed. And so how does Paul fix this? He appeals to Caesar. Paul was a Roman citizen, and that was the right of every Roman citizen, was to appeal their case to Caesar. Festus assured him that if he went back with him to Jerusalem, that he would be the hearer and he would be fair. I don't have any doubt Festus believed in his mind it was true that he would, but Paul knew it wasn't likely he'd even make it back to Jerusalem. And so he appeals to Caesar. Paul said if he had done anything worthy of death, that he was willing to accept punishment. This move to appeal to Caesar set in motion the events that would take him to Rome. Paul's attitude toward the law in this comment that if he was done anything worthy of death, he was willing to accept punishment, shows his willingness to be subservient to the law, to be willing to accept the law. And that says a lot about Paul. It tells you things about Christianity. If you go to Romans chapter 13 and read what Paul said to the Roman church about being obedient to the law, there's no question about where Christians stood. But there was Jewish fanning of the flames and gossip and all the bad stuff that they spread, along with other people who talked about, as Eddie pointed out, cannibalism and a misunderstanding of the observance of the Lord's Supper that made people distrust them. And ultimately it brought Rome down on them because they feared that this kingdom was going to get in the way of the empire. I already mentioned that Nero was not ill-disposed toward the Christians in the first 8 years of his reign. He had a Jewish mistress, and he eventually married her. But all these things, I think, are interesting because my view of Nero, when you think about Nero, is pretty much crazy the whole time. And it was not that way. Acts 25, 9 through 11, but Festus, willing to do the Jews a pleasure, answered Paul and said, Wilt thou go up to Jerusalem and there be judged of these things before me? Then said Paul, I stand at Caesar's judgment seat where I ought to be judged. To the Jews have I done no wrong, as thou very well knowest. For if I be an offender or have committed anything worthy of death, I refuse not to die. But if there be none of these things whereof these accuse me, no man may deliver me unto them. I appeal to Caesar. And so that settled it. Number 5, what did Festus do before he made his decision on Paul? That's another statement about Festus, I think, because he was willing to confer with the council and get it right. Not a big point, but he didn't see anything worthy of bonds with Paul, and so all of this plays into how he handled this. Then Festus, when he had conferred with the council, answered, Hast thou appealed unto Caesar? Unto Caesar shalt thou go. It's hard to think of Festus without thinking about Matthew Dillon, but different Festus. Number 6, to whom did Festus... we already answered that. Number 7... No, I'm sorry. Number 6, that is the next one. To whom did Festus seek opinion about Paul's case? King Agrippa. King Agrippa and Bernice had come to Caesarea to welcome Festus to his new position. If you're from Shady Valley, that's Bernice, and it's really hard to say Bernice. But it was Bernice. Bernice happens to be King Agrippa's sister. And he had another sister named Drusilla, we've already talked about. King Agrippa, Bernice, and Drusilla were all children of King Agrippa I, who had had James beheaded, and who just a short time later on was eaten of worms after he accepted adulation as a god. This is who Agrippa II is. Bernice was his sister. She was married when she was 13 years old, first time, became a widow. For some reason or other, my mind wants to say that she was a widow by the time she was 15, and I might have read that somewhere else, but the text doesn't say that, or the commentary I'm reading. She was married to an uncle and then widowed. She had taken up with Agrippa, and they were in an incestuous relationship. And there were rumors and accusations and scandal. And to try to get away from that, Agrippa had the king of Cilicia, whose name was Polemo, circumcised and marry her for money. And so he agrees to that, and they marry, and it didn't last. So she moves back in with Agrippa, and that's where she is when she gets here with Agrippa in Caesarea. She went on to have affairs with Titus and Vespasian, both military commanders for Rome. So Bernice wasn't exactly a pillar of virtue. And interesting side story here. When Agrippa was about 23 years old, he was given certain Palestinian territories as being under his rule. And so he became king, and he ruled over them as king into AD 70. He was the last Jewish king. And all this was done by Claudius. Claudius even gave him authority over the temple. All this is known by Josephus, by the way. And was given the right to appoint the high priest. Now we know how Ananias got in position and how all those things worked. The fact that he was in this position made him very familiar with Jewish affairs and customs. And so as Paul stands before him, he's going to talk to someone who's very familiar with the things Paul's going to say. Acts 25, 13 through 20. And after certain days, King Agrippa and Bernice came into Caesarea to salute Festus. When they had been there many days, Festus declared Paul's case unto the king, saying, There is a certain man left in bonds by Felix, about whom when I was at Jerusalem, the chief priests and the elders of the Jews informed me, desiring to have judgment against him. To whom I answered, It is not the manner of the Romans to deliver any man to die before that he is accused, having the accusers face to face, and have license to answer for himself concerning the crime laid against him. Therefore, when they were come hither, without any delay on the morrow, I sat on the judgment seat and commanded the man to be brought forth, against whom, when the accusers stood up, they brought none accusation of such things as I supposed, but had certain questions against him of their own superstition, and of one Jesus which was dead, whom Paul affirmed to be alive. And because I doubted of such manner of questions, I asked him whether he would go to Jerusalem and there be judged of these matters. Number 7, what troubled Festus about his decision to send Paul to Caesar? Didn't have any charges. The verses we just read show Festus didn't see any problem here. And so he now is asking Agrippa his opinion. Festus is going to have to write a letter to Nero explaining why he has put all the machinery in motion to take a man to Rome, to stand before Nero. That's kind of like getting to the Supreme Court here. There are a lot of steps to go through before you get heard by the final arbiter. And that's the case here. The Supreme Court denies a lot of cases because they don't see merit. And so if you're a lawyer and you're getting it there, you've got to be sure you got something that's worth them hearing. And Festus was in that position because he couldn't see anything worth Nero hearing. Jack? Yeah, all that plays into Festus's position, and certainly being new at the job, doing this right off the bat brings unwanted attention if you're Festus. Eddie?
Notice the number of times they've got him before the judgment seat. They need to realize, and all of us do, that when we make a decision on the judgment seat, we got to face the judgment seat. When they make their decision on earth, God makes his decision in heaven what he's going to do, like Pilate. When the guy, Pilate's gavel fell and said, crucify this man, God's gavel fell in heaven and said, you're guilty. And I think we forget that sometimes when we judge others. We've got to realize with what judgment we measure out, will face us again. So these same guys now are kind of playing authority roles, which government does. But sometimes government forgets. They got to give an account for the decisions and laws they make.
Right. It's a good point. Acts 25, 21 through 27, but when Paul had appealed to be reserved unto the hearing of Augustus, I commanded him to be kept till I might send him to Caesar. Then Agrippa said unto Festus, I would also hear the man myself. Tomorrow, said he, thou shalt hear him. And on the morrow, when Agrippa was come, and Bernice with great pomp was entered into the place of hearing, with the chief captains and principal men of the city, at Festus' commandment Paul was brought forth. And Festus said, King Agrippa, and all men which are here present with us, ye see this man, about whom all the multitude of the Jews hath dealt with me, both at Jerusalem and also here, crying that he ought not to live any longer. But when I found that he had committed nothing worthy of death, and that he himself had appealed to Augustus, I have determined to send him, of whom I have no certain thing to write unto my Lord. Wherefore I have brought him forth before you, and specially before thee, O King Agrippa, that after examination had, I might have somewhat to write. For it seemeth to me unreasonable to send a prisoner, and not withal to signify the crimes laid against him. In that reading, do you see an issue based on what I've already said this morning? Right. What emperor was Paul going to go stand before? Nero. What does the King James say? Augustus. People have tried to poke at Luke's rendition of this because he uses the word Augustus, but Augustus was a word they could use to talk toward any emperor because of what the word meant. And so Augustus was not the emperor at this point in time, but it is a word used to reference emperors in general because August references their high position. It's more of a title, yeah. So I meant to say something about that as I wrote that down. I'd forgotten it until I read it just now, but it's not an issue. Number 8, how did King Agrippa treat Paul? Who? That's the impression I get from reading it. Number 1, Agrippa was willing to hear the case. He wanted to hear Paul's story himself. And so in Acts 26:1, then Agrippa said unto Paul, Thou art permitted to speak for thyself. Then Paul stretched forth the hand and answered for himself. And so Agrippa gives every impression that he's willing to hear Paul and be open-minded about it. And we're going to see how open-minded as we get into it. Number 9, how did Paul respond to Agrippa? He was happy to plead his case. He acknowledged Agrippa's familiarity with Jewish law. He knew he was going to talk to somebody that understood. That was an issue with Festus. Festus, this was all new to him. He didn't have a knowledge of it, and Felix didn't care. Acts 26:2 through 23, you're going to see Paul reason through his journey to Christianity and his work as an evangelist. His logic leaves only one conclusion to the honest listener, and we'll see that as we read it. Paul says, I think myself happy, King Agrippa, because I shall answer for myself this day before thee touching all the things whereof I am accused of the Jews, especially because I know thee to be an expert in all customs and questions which are among the Jews, wherefore I beseech thee to hear me patiently. And Paul's going to go through his story, but as he addresses King Agrippa, he doesn't give a bunch of flowery baloney like Tertullus did when he was up there. He references the fact Agrippa knows the truth, and he's happy to talk to him about it. He says, My manner of life from my youth, which was at first among mine own nation at Jerusalem, know all the Jews, which knew me from the beginning, if they would testify that after the most straitest sect of our religion, I lived a Pharisee. Paul had operated freely. He had operated at the behest of the chief priests. They all knew who Paul was. They all knew what Paul did, and they're lying like dogs right now because of what they're saying about him. He says, And now I stand and am judged for the hope of the promise made of God unto our fathers, under which promise our 12 tribes instantly serving God day and night hope to come, for which hope's sake King Agrippa, I am accused of the Jews. Finish reading it. Why should it be a thing incredible with you that God should raise the dead? I verily thought with myself that I ought to do many things contrary to the name of Jesus of Nazareth, which thing I also did in Jerusalem, and many of the saints did I shut up in prison, having received authority from the chief priests, and when they were put to death, I gave my voice against them. And I punished them oft in every synagogue, and compelled them to blaspheme. And being exceedingly mad against them, I persecuted them even into strange cities. Whereupon, as I went to Damascus with authority and commission from the chief priests, at midday, O king, I saw on the way a bright light from heaven above the brightness of the sun, shining round about me and them which journeyed with me. And when we were all fallen to the earth, I heard a voice speaking unto me and saying in the Hebrew tongue, Saul, Saul, why persecutest thou me? It is hard for thee to kick against the pricks. And I said, Who art thou, Lord? And he said, I am Jesus, whom thou persecutest. But rise and stand upon thy feet. I have appeared unto thee for this purpose, to make thee a minister and a witness both of these things which thou hast seen, and of those things in which I will appear unto thee, delivering thee from the people and from the Gentiles, of whom now I send thee, to open their eyes and to turn them from darkness to light, and from the power of Satan unto God, and they may receive forgiveness of sins and inheritance among them which are sanctified by faith that is in me. Whereupon, O King Agrippa, I was not disobedient unto the heavenly vision, but showed first unto them of Damascus and at Jerusalem and throughout all the coasts of Judea, and then to the Gentiles, that they should repent and turn to God, and do works meet for repentance. For these causes the Jews caught me in the temple and went about to kill me. Having therefore obtained help of God, I continue unto this day, witnessing both to small and great, saying none other things than those which the prophets and Moses did say should come, that Christ should suffer, and that he should be the first that should rise from the dead and show light unto the people and to the Gentiles. And so in this passage you see Paul pointing back to the promise that all the Jews knew, points back to the promise that the Jews misunderstood because of their own selfish expectation, and then shows the logical progression of what happened. He shows his confusion about what it was because he didn't accept Jesus to begin with either, and he persecuted the church. But when Christ appeared before him, it became crystal clear in his mind, this is what we all have been looking for. And so Christianity is the illogical extension of Judaism, and he makes this case to Agrippa. And he reasons with him about how he was right in what he did. And all that takes place in this speech. If the Jews had been spiritual minded, they would have seen this come as well, because they've been looking for it since the promise to Abraham. Here it was, they missed it. Agrippa was familiar enough with that to hear and believe his story. Number 10, how did Festus view Paul after this speech? He said, much learning doth make you mad. He references his Pharisaical training. How does Agrippa respond to it? Number 11. Yeah, Agrippa knew enough about this, and after hearing Paul, he had moved Agrippa. He said, almost you persuade me to be a Christian. And Acts 26, 25 through 28. But he said, I'm not mad, most noble Festus, but speak forth the words of truth and soberness. For the king knoweth of these things, before whom I speak freely. For I am persuaded that none of these things are hidden from him, for this thing was not done in a corner. King Agrippa, believest thou the prophets? I know you believe. Then Agrippa said unto Paul, almost thou persuadest me to be a Christian. So that gets us to number 12, which Agrippa would have set Paul free had he not appealed to Caesar. But that appeal prevented him doing it. And so we'll take up with chapter 27 next week. Thanks for your attention.